Up next, we have Rob Dickinson, co-founder and CTO, see if I can talk, at Resurface Labs, Inc. And thank you, Rob, for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. All right.
And we'll be going through detecting and securing PII. I am very curious, what is the biggest point you want to get across on your presentation today?
Ooh, gosh.
You got a pre-Q&A.
It's just that there's no super easy button for dealing with this topic. So you really have, just like a lot of things in security, you really have to get into it and get oriented. There's really not not an easy way just to, do one specific thing and then you don't have anything else to worry about.
Got it. Thank you. And perfect. You are hiding it. So thank you so much. And thank you again for joining Interface.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. All right, so this talk is on detecting and securing PII, specifically around APIs and API connected systems. I'm Rob Dickinson, CTO at Resurface Labs, and I'm easy to find online. Twitter and email are listed there. Love to hear from you. Our agenda, there's a lot to pack in here. We're going to go really fast. But the agenda is we're going to talk about the challenge around PII, some of the anti-patterns that we see very frequently, and then some very good strategies and architecture patterns to orient you a little bit better to dealing with some of these challenges. So as it turns out, API monitoring is the key to better APIs, better observability in general is what helps us move from kind of a perimeter whack-a-mole approach to really having better and stronger API services. But a big part of that API monitoring, and this hits very close to home for us at Resurface, is that this means working with PII. Not just the PII that's involved in the actual transactions, but the PII that's involved in the observability and everything that you need to run your systems effectively, also to be able to identify attackers. So you really can't do APIs without working with PII at some level. At some point you're gonna get into this, and unfortunately, PII is not one of those topics that really makes people excited and enthusiastic to talk about. So, kind of the ranges of emotions and attitudes regarding this stuff, um, it gives you a headache. Maybe you'd rather just talk about something else. Maybe you just know that you're really not doing PII handling very well today, and that's probably not going to work out very well down the road. These are certainly things that we all see. But the fact of the matter is that insecure handling of PII is getting expensive. It's not just GDPR. Those style ideas are really making their way into the industry in a lot of places. Even if it's not that you're getting fined because of PII, the risks of mishandling may be a risk to your brand. That in of itself can be very expensive. All right, so unfortunately, as we said, PII is not the easiest set of problems to tackle ever. There are some real challenges around these topics. One of the first ones is that there's tightening regulations around this. PII is very much a moving target, right? So you really have to be up to date on what are the latest standards of care, not just in your jurisdiction, but in every jurisdiction that you operate in. That's a hard thing over time. It is a moving target. These regulations change very quickly, just like the APIs are changing very quickly. One of the specific examples of that is there's an expanding definition of what PII really means. If you go back to like the old PCI standards, PII was a credit card number. That's not true anymore. GDPR and CCPA, they've redefined those notions of PII to be much more expansive and cover many more kinds of data fields than before. There are a lot of vendors and a lot of platforms where a lot of this data gets stored. So PII ends up everywhere. That means you're dealing with all these systems. That in itself is a huge challenge, especially because in a lot of those cases, we're talking about apps and databases that you can't change directly, either because you don't have the development talent or you don't own the IP. That in itself is a huge problem. So what this leads to is you really need a lot of different techniques to manage security and privacy protections. Again, it's not just one easy button that you can hit. Those are all things that are very centered on kind of the organization side, right? As we say, there's no easy button. There's a high cost of compliance when you look at all that being put together. Security by default, in particular, is one of those concepts that is much harder to define than it sounds at first. Security by default, privacy by default, again, those are moving targets and changing all the time. We also are seeing a lot more cases for legitimate data sharing. That's why you're exposing these things through APIs. You're not exposing them through APIs to keep them private. You're exposing them through APIs to be able to share this data better. So there are very legitimate cases around that. But that requires things like implementing revocation, handling zero-day failures, getting developer attention to work on all these things. So obviously, this is a hard set of problems. There are also some anti-patterns, some real myths that are out there that you want to stay away from. These are things that sound simple, but they really aren't that effective. One strategy is, kind of put your head in the sand. We don't really have any PII. Again, if you think that's true, really go back and look at those definitions about what PII really is. IP addresses are PII. Anything that could be fingerprinted is PII. The antithesis of that is a shortcut to thinking where you say, well, we'll treat all data like it's PII. That sounds good, but it's not really very practical. You do have different kinds of data, and that's something you have to look at. There can be a really tough legal approval processes to get through. That can be tough. God mode administrators that can do everything. That's total anti-pattern. Not getting user consent is increasingly important. Having undisclosed third-party data transfers. Having databases where you collect all that data in one place, where that data can be easily hacked and searched. Doing overly destructive transforms. You strip out all the PII, so you never even know what customer was impacted by a particular problem or what data went with what customer. That's a very dangerous pattern. One-time masking, especially masking at the perimeter, is really not enough. And just encrypting at rest is not enough. And just doing this in production is not enough. So all these are things that, again, they might sound good on paper, but if this describes your strategy for dealing with PII today, you probably have to have some work to do to get to a healthier place. So if you're doing these things, you might be feeling like, oh my gosh, we got to do something. And what I love here is, of course, Homer starts rewriting things. But that's not what you have to do. So here's some easy strategies for dealing with PII, for discovering and securing this PII at runtime and having proper governance in place. The first thing is you want to start with your people, start with your organization. So any security plan has to start with the people, because people are always the weakest link. People can be compromised just as easily as systems can be compromised. So you always start with the people. And what you're going to do is you're going to optimize for the number of conspirators that are required. There's different schools of thought around how large a conspiracy has to be detected. Experts will debate the numbers, but usually the numbers you hear, somewhere between 3 and 7. conspirators is usually a range that a lot of people agree on. So you want to make sure that no one person has access to everything, right? You want to break that up so it requires a group of conspirators to actually steal a bunch of PII. So what you're going to do then is you're going to design your systems so that you inform the narrowest group level and user level permissions at runtime that you can. What this is going to do then is it's going to allow you to regularly audit those databases and permissions. So basically what we're doing is we're saying no one person has access to everything. There's going to be narrow rights. Then those rights are going to be divided up again, so no one group or no one person has access to everything. And then you're regularly going to audit and revisit that to make sure that the right people have the right permissions to the right things. So that from a people and a process perspective can easily mirror what we're doing more on the technology side. Is that on the technology side, we're moving more towards microservices. Those microservices tend to be more siloed. So from a security perspective, I'd argue that that's actually a really good thing, because that process of partitioning and siloing is exactly what we want to do for security in general and for protecting our PII in specific. So microservices are great for breaking those different kinds of data apart. So again, having those permissions in place. So you may be able to access the user data, but not the billing data. You may be able to access the billing data, but not the operational data. So breaking that data down into those different microservices, I think is a great opportunity. Have your security and your permissioning and your PII handling then reflect those individual microservices, and it'll be more compartmentalized. Now you can start to think about optimizing for the number of silos that an attacker has to successfully breach to carry out a system level attack. So I have to gain access to the user system. I also have to gain access to the billing system. I have to put all of those puzzle pieces together to actually put the whole piece together in terms of the user data that I want to store or I want to steal. So again, we're optimizing for the number of silos, which sounds a lot like optimizing for the number of microservices that we have in a lot of places. So again, if you put it on that level, it can actually be fairly natural. You want to keep the data close to those sources. Again, microservices tend to encourage this because the data used by a microservice in a lot of cases is stored locally to that microservice or as part of that microservice. So keeping that data close to the source in general is a good recommendation. One thing that's very important for proper PII handling is how that data eventually expires. This data, now there is some data that you want to live forever, customer transaction data that has to be retained for business purposes, but there's a lot of other data that might have PII, might have IP addresses, might have sensitive headers, whatever it is, that you need to keep for a while and eventually get rid of. You have a 90-day store of that particular kind of data. A lot of security tools will maintain data for a certain amount of time. Make sure that data gets expired out automatically. That's one of the most important considerations in GDPR and CCPA is making sure that happens. Another very important aspect to this is being able to monitor how your PII is moving on your networks and through your applications. So being able to specifically monitor where that PII is going, not just the databases that PII lives in. That's the thing that people think of most, and where a lot of our brains go to first is the data at rest. But it's really, where is that PII flowing within the organization? How is it moving through those APIs? Just because an API may not be storing that PII, it may still be handling that PII. It may be an intermediary for that PII. So everywhere that that PII moves on the network and through your applications is an opportunity for leakage or for mishandling or misstorage of that PII. So if you don't know where that PII is moving on your network, you've got a problem. And then the last technique that I'll talk about is virtualizing access to those master data records through a query layer. So basically having a virtual layer that allows you to say, we can layer on user permissions or group level permissions to any kind of data that we have in our organization, and be able to make sure that those proper controls are in place. So just a quick shout out for Resurface. Resurface helps with a lot of these problems. We are in the business of production API monitoring. We're purpose built for REST and GraphQL traffic. We continuously scan for security and quality problems, also for PII usage. And we have a hot data lake for retroactive analysis. So whether that's continuous scanning or after the fact scanning, we can help identify these issues that your APIs are facing and how that PII is actually moving on your network, especially cases where that PII is actually leaking. So being able to put together those breadcrumbs and say, this is an attack, and that attack is actually getting back PII as a result or as a return from those attacks is very important. So knowing where the PII is moving on the network and also understanding what the context is that a legitimate context for using that PII? If it's not a legitimate context, then it's a leak. And you absolutely have to be identifying where those leaks happen and be ready to respond to that. The last technique here, the most advanced, is creating the separation between your physical and your virtual access. Databases are great for this. We've been doing a lot of work in this area for Resurface and also with Trino, which is one of our favorite tools to do this. And so the idea here is that you have your physical databases that are out there. You have your physical places where that data is stored. As we said, in a lot of cases, these are places where these are difficult to change. You're not going to redo those databases where they live today. These are your raw data records. They're system specific. Those are difficult to change. This is where the highest standard of care is to implement a two-person rule on the administration at this layer. So you say, when we're doing something at the physical layer, we're doing something at the administration layer, then we have a two-person rule for admins. Why do you want that? You want that because your internal admins are actually one of the largest sources of leaks when it comes to PII, which I know is hard to say. It's hard to admit. It's hard to internalize that. But that is true, right? The people that have access to this data are the most likely to steal it. So having a two-person rule on administration at a physical level is really the highest standard of care that you can, one of the highest standards of care that you can hope to get to. Then what you do is we overlay on top of that a virtual schema. So if you think about this from like the traditional database perspective, it's the difference between a create table and a create view. So we have our physical schema, that's the raw data records. PII is probably going to be present there. But then we can wrap that in a view. And as part of that view, now we can say, let's pull out specific columns, let's pull out specific rows. We can also mask or anonymize that data at the view layer. We can make that custom to an audience. So we can tie that to user roles. We can tie that to group roles. If we get something wrong at that layer, it's easy to change because it's all virtual. So it's easy to change that retroactively. And here's now where you can open that back up and say, it's okay to have single user access at this level because you know that those proper view controls are in place, proper governance is in place. So that's where you can step out of the two-person rule. So again, maybe I should have had that on the list of anti-patterns, but if the anti-pattern is you should have a two-person rule for everything, this is a way out, or a simpler way to handle that. You actually don't necessarily need two-person rule for everything if you can properly virtualize. We do that with some technology called Trino. You may know it by its previous name, which is Presto SQL, but one of the greatest big data projects that's out there today. So that idea of being able to separate physical from virtual data access is something that really Trino is a wonderful tool to do that, because Trino works with all these existing data sources that are out there, and Resurface is even one of those. And when it comes to handling PII now, this is a way to build and overlay that query layer that can enforce those policies through standard SQL views. This is all standards based, all stuff that SQL databases have done forever. But this is a way to basically take all those existing databases and wrap better PII policies on top of them, doing that retroactively at the user and at the group level without having to change any of the databases that are already out there. If you do that, then you can get from a place where you kind of know that things aren't going to work out too well with your PII, to really being able to use and leverage PII effectively within your organization. And that opens up all kinds of creative possibilities for really creative work. And that's my talk.
I dig it. I dig it. And thank you again, Rob. Now, I know I already asked you a question at the beginning, but a big question it would be for those who like tackling PII and PHI challenges. Do you know of products or resources or a book or a blog that people can dive deeper into the subject?
Gosh, it is really difficult right now. I mean, I think that the best thing to do really is to look inside your network. You know, who can you get to easily? You know, who are the CSOs that are handling this? Especially folks in Europe, I think have a really good sense of GDPR. And the biggest part of this is that it is absolutely a moving target. I mean, how we think about privacy and security is changing almost quarter to quarter right now. So yeah, staying on top of kind of what the latest ideas are is super important. But unfortunately, there really isn't like just one technology that can be applied, and I think that's one of the easy ways to push back legitimately against some of these regulations, is to say, oh yeah, GDPR is like, there's some great ideas, but there's no database that natively provides those functions like out of the box that you can just write a check for. So the fact that there's a lot of assembly required right now is and that it's a moving target is really two of the biggest problems.
Other than the moving target, it seems like there's a great opportunity for someone to create all this and create these resources. Now, I would say one thing that is coming to mind that could be very helpful is following Rob on LinkedIn or any other resources and see what he's up to and just learn from what he's posting.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're doing. We're just trying to participate in this community and learn and share. And frankly, security is hard to do this, right? Like a lot of people feel like they need to hold their security thinking back. Like in the DevOps world, you see a lot more conference materials around like how things went wrong and things failed, and but you don't see that as much in the security community. Like here's the huge breach we had and what we learned from it. You do get a lot of that though in person to person communications. So that's where I really think using your network and especially using those personal relationships, some of these security topics are very hard to talk about in open forums. especially if you've got the black eye from it.
Yeah. And thank you, Rob, again for joining us today at Interface this year. And we are stoked that we had you, and we will see you again, hopefully at another conference.